2013. You're listening to SYN Boldly, the podcast, the Sign Your Name Project. I'm your host, Trey Comstock. With me this week is Kathleen Royston.
Hello.
And Stephen Doss.
Hello.
Those of you joining us live, we deeply apologize for the late hour. We needed some group therapy before we could start tonight's show, for we are mostly clergy, and this week we'll be talking about clergy anger and depression, and how some of that may or may not be caused by Congress's inability to compromise.
Yes.
But we start with this idea of clergy anger and its links to clergy depression in this week's news. So, Stephen, you brought this story in. Tell me about the link between anger and depression.
Well, clergy are angry. But don't worry, it's not your fault.
It's never my fault!
The fault of clergy.
Yeah. Basically, it's talking about, and I have the article in front of me. I will admit, I was only able to skim it, but the way it sounds like it's that there's so many pressures that come from every side in a clergy congregation relationship, other clergy relationship, that they use the term that pastors are inherently nice people, and nice people get taken advantage of.
I actually have read the article several times, so I can jump in.
Please do.
It was published on Ministry Matters, which is one of the websites, I think is an official United Methodist publication. And there's been a lot going around lately about clergy depression, and this article makes a very provocative suggestion that the source of clergy depression is clergy anger. And anger that stems from dealing with, I think the article actually says this, dealing with people being unreasonable, and how clergy internalize that anger because you can't scream too much, and it gets translated into depression. And I think what was even more interesting than the article itself, which was fascinating, what was even more interesting were some of the comments, that this hit a nerve, and people in the comments talked about not only relationships with abusive congregations, but also relationships with abusive pastors. So associates having these issues with the senior pastor, and even senior pastors having issues with district superintendents and bishops. And so that the anger is not only from dealing with people in congregations, it's also a sort of greater systematic problem as well. And it's hard for all of you lay people out there. It's hard being the pastor. I'm not yet, but people come to pastors with anger that they and frustrations in their own life, and frequently the pastor is the safe person that they can take it out on. So pastors get the brunt of a lot of things, and because people aren't necessarily the best at saying, I'm really upset about this other thing going on in my life, it gets personal very quickly. And that pastors carry that around, and there's a lot of anger with that. And that systems can be abusive as well. So denominational structures, annual conferences, churches. There's just as a pastor, you're in a system, and there can be abusive systems as well, and that leads to a fair amount of anger. So, anyone want to comment?
Well, I'm the pastor of a church. And I can see where this is coming from. At the moment, have a very positive relationship with my congregation, as a whole. It's, I've only been in the job 6 weeks, so talk to me in a while, but, they may get tired of me yet. But at the moment, it's definitely a very positive relationship. But I can see where that's going, because you don't have, in that congregation, especially if you're kind of the senior pastor, or in my case, the only pastor, you don't really have a safe person to vent to outside of your family or your separate circle of friends. And if you're in a place like I am with my church, nearby when I'm at church, I have no circle of friends beyond my congregation. And in the Methodist system, it kind of lends itself towards that, because you can be appointed anywhere in your annual conference at any time. So you can end up far from home with, no friends beyond your family in your congregation. And that's not necessarily a psychologically very safe place to be. And so you have kind of nowhere to go. The only place you have to go is internal. And that's, as Master Yoda said, fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate, and hate leads to suffering. And while I realize that's Star Wars and not psychology, there's some logic to that. That when you're internalizing these feelings of anger, it's going to lead to your own suffering.
I think there's also this mistake that the job of pastors is to be nice to everybody, and that's it. And it is, and I think in some ways, you obviously super angry pastors who are externalizing that anger. It's not necessarily a good thing, but I think that there's a real lack of ability to express your humanity when you're the person in charge, and that when people are being hurtful, and people say, the worst things that have ever been said to me by another human being have been said in church. And you can't respond when you are the person who is, like it or not, they're, I don't want to say standing in for God, but I think in some people's
mediating
minds,
the divine human relationship.
Thank you. That you can't get ugly. And people have a hard time separating your vocation from you as a human being.
Well, but it comes down to you can't get ugly. And, I think I've advocated this on the show before, but all preachers should probably be in therapy. Mm-hmm. I have a professor who's a professor of pastoral care, Dr. Ellison, and when he's inviting comments to the class, he's like, "I'm in therapy, I can handle it, y'all." But there's a really deep logic to that. He takes pride in having referred 50 students who are training to be pastors to therapy, because not because we're inherently more depressed than anybody else, but that the nature of, and there's a lot of professions that tend towards depression, but pastors tend to be one of them, and it's dangerous for your congregation if you can't deal with what's being thrown at you. Or rather, that you're not going about the means to deal with what's being laid on you. Because they're going to come at you with their flying crap. And in a way, your job is to catch that.
I also have to wonder, though, pastorally, if part of your job is to help people understand that throwing that stuff is not appropriate, and not, that the sort of mean-spiritedness that gets thrown at pastors is problematic in a Christian community. That's not how we talk to each other, and not that people carry their own things and all of that, but I also have to wonder if pastorally that making it understood that kind of behavior isn't appropriate.
Absolutely, but I think we also are placed in the position of modeling radical forgiveness. Mm-hmm. And so when inevitably that hits the fan, you have to be the first to forgive. Mm-hmm. And that is, if you're not managing your own self-care, that can be a very painful process.
The other interesting part of this article, going along with self-care, is what it suggests is spiritual disciplines, essentially, as a way to practice emotional detachment from that. So when you are healthy spiritually, and this is what the article argues, which there's some pushback, if you are healthy spiritually, this kind of business won't affect you in quite the same way, which I can totally get on board with, but also part of me is, if if pastors are indeed to be shepherds of their congregation, then shepherding involves a certain amount of corralling. Right, like,
Yes.
there's some nipping at heels that needs to happen. And so I think that, I'm a good Methodist, so I see everything as both and. I do agree that pastors need to practice radical forgiveness, but I also think this sort of unconditional acceptance of hurtful behavior is problematic too.
Well, it's what I always refer to within my own family as the "that's just Adolf" syndrome. Right, so this is again, the Nazi argument's rhetorical fallacy at this point, but it's what I call it the "that's just Adolf," right? That there were people in Adolf Hitler's life when he was doing whatever things he did that was like, oh, that's just Adolf, and that's not okay. You can't do that. You can't just dismiss it as, oh, that's just Bob, or that's just Adolf. There has to be some accountability, and I think, Kathleen, you're right, clergy need to be a part of that accountability. Steven, do you want to jump into this?
Well, all the chats in our chat room posted an article that I looked at, and apparently, according to Forbes magazine,
Forbies,
the happiest occupation is...
taxidermist?
No, clergy.
How? Okay.
That's fascinating.
Defined as.
Their response was, it's because they are not worldly that makes them so happy. The least worldly are reported to be the happiest of all. I wonder, do people in clergy positions, do they just give off a vibe?
Yeah, I mean, what I want to know is how is Forbes quantifying happiness? Because I can appear cheerful every Sunday.
Yeah, and that's probably what it... Yeah, it's probably what it is. It's like, well, they look happy, so they must be happy.
Yeah, that's a little... And I think that's another part of it, right? There's this enormous amount of pressure, even when your life feels like it's falling apart, to go to church and, like, be happy. Mm-hmm. And appear to be happy.
I'm under a lot of stress right now, but I go, that disappears when I, step out on the dais. And that, to me, is actually part of what's so straining about being clergy. There is a line from a terrible rap song by Sean Puffy Combs.
You didn't do it right. Sean Puffy
Combs. That it's easy to be Puff, but it's harder to be Sean. That is, in a way,
it's easier to play a persona.
It's easy to step on that stage and be that persona. But it's very hard to have that persona be who I am.
Yeah.
Like, I've been an actor my whole life. And so I can step out and, so happy to see, and, make them believe it. I can sell it. But it's damaging when that's not real. It's easy to be Puff, but it's harder to be Sean.
And I think that's why, pastors fall over on Sunday afternoons. There are no 4 hours of my entire week, which involves lots of 17-hour days, I might add. There is nothing I do that is more exhausting than the 4 hours I spend on Sunday mornings. Yeah. And I'm not in the pulpit. Yeah. I'm in lay ministry, and still.
Yeah. No.
So there's that, and also the pressure, and I felt this, I remember feeling this even as an involved layperson in the church, is the pressure on Sunday mornings to pretend that you're not falling apart when everybody around you... Mm-hmm. And like that enormous, and you can feel it, like if you've ever been in church at a time of intense personal strife, mm-hmm. You start to sort of feel it in other people too, and how much effort it takes to be there, with your pretty shoes on and your eyeliner on, and pretend that you are not an absolute hot
Honey,
mess.
if I show up in my pretty shoes and my eyeliner, that's going to send a very different
But
message.
I remember when I was going through one of the hardest things I've ever been through in my life, I remember sitting in the pew as a layperson and thinking, I wonder if all the other adults hurt as much as I do. And thinking, yep, probably.
But I think that's one of those things that has always been really damaging to me about how church gets done.
Yeah, agreed.
Because, I felt uncared for a very long time because we all had to show up on Sunday morning and everything had to be okay.
Yeah.
And everything
wasn't.
was not okay for a very long time. And so the youth kind of cared for themselves in these weird ways. But it's because, and it's not even, like, my home church is wonderful in many ways. But there still is that pull to always be okay.
Yeah.
And everything's fine as long as you show up in church. I wasn't wearing my eyeliner, but show up in church with my hair gelled, my collared shirt, the shoes I only wore on Sundays, and if I could put a smile on my face. Oh, he's such a nice boy. Well, yeah, but I was such a nice boy dying on the inside.
Yep.
And so whether you're clergy or lay, we need to find ways where that church is a safe space. And perhaps it is on the clergy to be willing to lay our stuff out there. You know, one of the things I have committed to in my life is when I feel it's appropriate, I tell my story. And I do, and I'm honest about that, and it's not easy, and it's not always fun, but because these things need to be talked about in church. Suicide and depression need to be talked about in church on Sunday morning, or what are we doing as church?
Yep.
Really?
But church is supposed to make me feel good. Church is supposed to, when I go to church is supposed to, be a boost for me. And if I hear about that, the pastor, is it? And yes, I am playing devil's advocate.
I understand.
Okay.
Yeah.
I just wanted to bring that out there. But I see the pastor as this stalwart in this sea of uncertainty, that the one person I can trust is Pastor Trayer.
Sure, throw it on me.
If I'm being
I am
Southern,
Pastor Trey.
or Miss Kathleen.
I'm Pastor Trey. Sure, throw it.
I will end you, Doss.
I'm just saying. But yeah. So how can I am a layperson. I'm not going to be clergy. I don't think they want me as clergy.
I want you as clergy.
Aw. But so how can lay people get out of the mindset that clergy are these fortresses of steel and...
Well, I think there's a line.
Mm-hmm.
And again, Dr. Ellison, who trained me in pastoral care, talks about this. That are you laying something out there because you need more therapy? Mm-hmm. Or are you laying something out there because you think it is constructive for your community? I don't know if he actually uses the phrase constructive community, but he draws the distinction between you laying your stuff out there for the good of your community and you laying your stuff out there for you because you have not done you have not dealt with it in therapy.
Yeah. As someone I don't remember who it was, but someone I know used to say the pulpit is not your psychiatrist's couch.
So, yeah, it's the exact same idea.
Mm-hmm. And there's a difference between like working out your issues in a public way and then saying these are some issues that I have or have had.
And setting up as a space where it is okay for us to share the space, because you can turn that into people will walk away feeling better. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Not necessarily uplifted, right? But better. Yeah. One of the most meaningful worship experiences I've ever had was a worship leader at Eastside Church here in Atlanta by the name of Andy. Laid out, these really deep and painful things that have happened to him and how he was able to he felt that God stayed with him through it, even if he didn't always see it. And, there was a lot of deep pain. And as a result of that worship service, I removed the bracelets that I've worn on my left wrist since I was in high school. And I no longer wear those bracelets because his story, I was able to set myself free. And in hearing him lay his story on God, I was able to lay more of my story on God too. And in hanging in my office now is the painting that was done during that worship service. And and that painting hangs there as a reminder to me that I can be set free partly because of Andy's honesty. Now, Andy may have, Mandy may have crossed the line, and Mandy may need more therapy, I don't know. But that was very, very meaningful to me in a way that I'm a pastor, but the Sunday morning worship is seldom that profoundly meaningful, that I'm able to move on from this albatross that I wore around my wrist. There's a place for it. Is it every Sunday? No. It is, as in anything, there's balance.
Yeah.
But I think this needs to be a space where we can talk about these things.
I think it's also not just about sort of deep issues. I think it's also a matter of being okay with your own humanity.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, I mean, I don't think I could do this without my sense of humor.
Mm-hmm.
That I couldn't do this if I couldn't laugh at myself and the hard things in the world too. And I think that that's a really important part of it. And a really good coping tool. Because there is... This line of work puts you into contact with people at their best and at their worst. And that humor... And granted, sometimes among ourselves it turns into kind of really dark, inappropriate... Like if you have not had the joy of being around clergy when there aren't a lot of lay people around, it is a delight. But I think that that's a really important thing too, is keeping our senses of humor, and I think that helps with anger too. One of my favorite stories, I won't go into the sordid details, but within 6 months of being in my first church job, I had someone tell me that Satan was moving in my life because I was pushing my radical liberal social agenda on the children. And
like
that story is hilarious. I mean, it was not funny at the time. But there is something about processing difficult situations using humor that I think can be really helpful. And doing, I'm obviously not with individuals, but doing that in the pulpit too, I think is powerful and humanizing. That we're not, the pastors I've liked the best have not been the ones that I would say are the quote holiest.
Yeah, there is, and I probably have not done a good enough job of this with my own congregation, of making myself a human. Because that it's a struggle, right? Because I'm half their age, and this is my first appointment, and so I'll probably confess I have not been human enough with them. I have been striving too hard to in all things be that perfect image of the young pastor that I actually deplore. But it's an interesting tension when you are up there, right? And you're being judged, and in my case, I'm being very kindly judged by 60 dear souls. But still, they're looking to me to be something, and to a certain extent be something I'm not, which is a totally whole human.
Yeah. I think that pastors, and preachers particularly, we bear the truth, but we are not the truth. And I think that that's an important distinction to make. And I think it's terrifying. And you do, when you preach, we were talking about this earlier off internets, is when you preach, you bear part of your soul. And
that's why clergies and actors go crazy.
Right.
It's a very vulnerable space.
And you open yourself up to, because the way that we think about God is so deeply personal, and the way we read the Bible is really personal, and then to stand up in front of a bunch of people and say, this is how I found God in this week's text, let me offer it to you, is just, there's a lot of vulnerability there in and of itself. But I'm not sure that people recognize that. I don't think that people recognize that as an act of humanity without there also being some, things like humor and sort of naming it. I don't think that people look at preachers and say, this is their soul I'm seeing. Yeah. They say, this is a sermon that I liked or didn't like.
Yeah, and there's difficult to separate it. Speaking of things I don't like, though, is this week's discussion. So, today is October the 1st, 2013. Today, the U.S. government, the federal government, shut down. I'll accept essential functions, which are strangely defined.
I'm sure they are.
Well, State Department's one of them. A good chunk of CDC is part of it. Those are the only two I've run into today.
50% of the Department of Defense is still around.
Either way.
Anyway.
About 800,000 federal employees are currently on unpaid furlough because Congress could not pass a continuing resolution because Congress has not been able to pass a budget since the dawn of the Obama administration.
Yep.
So, this is bad. No matter what political stripe you're of, the state we're in is bad. Whether you agree that the government should be shut down or not, the inability of Congress to compromise is a bad thing. And there are many kind of implications for it, but what I wanted us to talk about is what is the theological implications of a country divided? And what is our role as Christians and as Christian leaders, which are most of the folks that listen to this podcast, what is our role in that? Because Congress is shut down. Congress has brought the country to a screeching halt, putting at risk any recovery that was underway. Although there is a great hashtag going around Twitter of furlough pickup lines.
Oh, no.
Many of them are wildly inappropriate, but my favorite one that's appropriate is, hey, I just met you, and this is crazy, and we're on furlough, so call me maybe.
Oh.
Oh, but what do we do? What do we as Christian leaders, how do we speak into this fundamental division that seems to be running throughout our country of red and blue, or Tea Party and not, or whatever?
Well, we have to be an example of a people who can compromise. Ultimately, we are going to have differences of opinion on some things. But they shouldn't stop us from accomplishing the big things that we as Christians are called to do, such as loving your neighbor, whatever slant you want to take that, working to help those who need our help, such as the people on furlough who are not getting a paycheck, who probably, let's be honest, some of them make $10 an hour.
Yeah, government takes care of you once you retire, but there are very few really high-paying government jobs.
Yeah. And ultimately, that's something we can do on a very personal level is to take care of the people that are affected by this and reach out to them and say, hey, we're on two different sides of this argument, but you are still my brother or sister, and I am still called to love you. So what can I do to help? As for the political the stuff, I think we have to start thinking what it means to use the buzzword that I hate so much, a Christian nation, which I take as a nation made up of predominantly Christian people, not a nation founded by God.
I love you. I'm not sure that's a reality. It's not a demographic reality.
It's not a demographic.
It depends how you
Sorry,
count.
buddy.
Technically,
we're 80.
Technically, yes.
Technically, like now, 95 or what?
No, it's not. I mean, it's not like that. But it's certainly, according to available demographics, then technically the majority of Americans call themselves Christian.
Then it's time for them to start acting like it.
I think the argument you can make is not the nation itself, but government officials. Because I think even if we're a pluralistic nation, who's still in power?
Mm-hmm.
But okay,
I'm
regardless of demography. Mm-hmm. In the end, blessed are the peacemakers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, what I'm more interested in is how do we make peace? We, especially who do a progressive theology show that often strays into politics.
Yeah.
So how do we make peace? Because
Well-
to a certain extent, to take a position that isn't totally unreasonable, what we do feeds into this.
Mm-hmm.
What we do here feeds into this deadlock. Because we're speaking into that deadlock. And in our case, we're speaking from a minority position into a deadlocked church.
Yeah.
But that deadlock, the reason there is that deadlock is partly a reflection of our broader culture.
Yeah.
Our split looks a lot like Congress with some slightly changed percentages, but it's still a split that seems irreconcilable. How do,
It's going to take...
should we stop?
No, we're not. We shouldn't stop, because when you stop, then selfishness wins. That's what the people in Congress are being. They're being selfish. They're saying, because the loud, vocal minority in the Republican Party wants this, everyone wants this, so we have to say that Obamacare stinks and we're going to shut down the government because this stinks, even though Obamacare is still funded as an essential function.
Yes!
So they have accomplished jack patooey.
Oh, no, they've accomplished worse than nothing.
Yeah. They've tried to hold the country hostage, except the part of the country that they wanted to hold hostage left and said, no thank you, good sirs. I'm going this way.
And if I stray too much into politics, you can hit me. Although I'm still not convinced that religion and politics are ever separate, so there you go.
Jesus didn't separate them.
Nope.
But there was an interesting, I guess, blog post in The Atlantic that pointed out that this is not necessarily a red state versus blue state kind of fight, that this is within one party.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That this is factions within one
This
party.
is a red state versus
And I
red
think
state thing.
This is a red state versus
actually,
red state.
Right, and I almost wonder if we're mapping it onto church, if that's a little bit of what's going on when we talk about these issues in the church. Just a thought.
I mean, I think that's a great point. I think that it can be seen in the church. It's, for certain issues, there's a vocal... There's a vocal side and a bit more moderate side on whatever side of an issue there is. There will always be that, and it's infighting, and then eventually nothing will come of it because you don't have the votes or the committees that are needed to get stuff accomplished, so nothing gets done.
There's a line from one of my favorite musicals, 1776. Piddle, twiddle, and resolve, not one damn thing do we solve. Twiddle, piddle, and resolve, nothing's ever solved. That often, in things run by legislatures, which is the United Methodist Church, which is most mainline Protestant churches in this country, which is this country in Congress, we're ruled by legislatures.
Yeah.
And there is always an ability for a extreme minority faction to hijack a legislature.
Yes.
Yep.
Which is what's happening.
Yep.
I argue, which is part of what's happening in the United Methodist Church, and is certainly what is happening here in Congress. Ted Cruz and the Tea Party fellows are hijacking what was designed to be a place of compromise. And you have the moderate Republican leadership with their poster boy, John Boehner, who has, for a very long time, Speaker Boehner has been trying to hold this country together while holding off the tiger of the Tea Party.
Yeah.
And it's a fight he can't necessarily win. So everybody, bring this back to faith. Pray for John Boehner.
I heard him on NPR. Tag. I heard him on NPR.
In your Prius?
And I don't remember. Yes, my Prius. And I don't remember exactly what he was saying, but I remember thinking, well, he sounds really moderate, which I don't ever remember thinking about him before.
Well,
It's because he's the face of a party hijacked.
Yeah, and like that, and maybe that's my super, dyed-in-the-wool Democrat self. There, I added myself. That's right.
Boom.
I know it had to be done. but is there's I don't know. I have a fair amount of empathy for what's going on. That this has to be really hard for people who are on the other side of the political spectrum.
Yeah.
And I've seen this in conversations with my family, that there are moderate Republicans who find this is upsetting.
Yeah, my grandfather.
As I do.
My grandparents did a wonderful thing. They surprised me and came to my church on Sunday unexpectedly. It was wonderful. And we were having a conversation after church about politics. I have a degree in political science, so it comes up. And we have an amicable disagreement. I am a liberal. They are not. And it's kind of a joke in our family. We get along we talk politics and we still get along. It's kind of fun. But he said he's not voting for anybody anymore. Yeah. He has been a lifelong Republican. He, I believe, has given to the party at times. He is a strong advocate of fiscal conservatism, blah, blah, blah. Like, very strong Republican for very decent reasons. My father and my grandfather are proof that Republicans can have a soul. So I'm told. I am speaking hyperbolically to be funny. Of course they can. But he's saying he's not voting for anybody. Yeah. Which, for him is huge. He served in the military. He believes in, participating in this country. I doubt there's an election he's missed since he was able to vote. And yet he doesn't want to vote for anyone because of the deadlock in the process.
I think the biggest problem, that the underlying problem of all this, is the fact that in the House of Representatives you have to be willing to be on the fringe, because as soon as you are elected, it's time to start thinking about re-election.
And there's 400 something of them.
And there's 400 and something of them.
Yeah.
520. There's a lot.
Hundreds.
There's hundreds. That's better. Trey's going to look it up. But
keep talking.
As soon as you get in, and so you have to make a splash. And if you can say, I was against this thing that you don't like, Obamacare, and I was willing to do whatever it took, that makes you look, that's good for a re-election in a state where, or not in a state, but in a district where that is something they, are against with such fervor that they're willing to put everything else on the line because they don't like that one thing. And so
I was right. It's 435.
I owe you a Coke.
Anyway,
I mean, that's the thing, is like, with the Senate, you're there for 6 years. So you have time to work, to get to know these other people, to see where, you can reach out, where they can reach out to you, and to have that compromise. And if I'm not mistaken, there's been a bit of compromise in the Senate.
There has to be.
There has to be.
Because of how narrow the margin is in the Senate, to a certain extent, there has to be some compromise.
And as for the House, well, you have to say, no, I'm putting my foot down, because
that's the only way to stand up.
That's the only way to stand up.
Now, there's two things I'll say about that. First of all, if you want a real insight into the state of Congress in the past few years, there's a great book, and I can't ever remember the author, but it's called Do Not Ask What Good We Do. It's a journalist who basically embedded himself in the House of Representatives for a while. And I saw him interviewed a few years back on, I think it was Jon Stewart. But he does a wonderful job of kind of characterizing all of these people and their motivations, and particularly looking about what's happening in the Republican Party right now. So I absolutely recommend it if you want to learn more about the dynamics at play. The other thing I want to bring up is the interesting dynamic that's happening at the moment, that this charge is being led by a senator. This is being led by Ted Cruz out of Texas. And that's part of what I think is the political science major in me. This is part of what's upsetting the balance, is that you have a senator, and senators generally have more prestige within the congressional system than representatives, speaking something other than what the party whips and Speaker Boehner are saying. And so you have this real impasse of party leadership that creates a diabolical situation. What I think we will always be left pondering and struggling with to do is, how do we live into this in a way that is both prophetic for what we believe, but generates workable compromise. And I don't necessarily think we have an answer to that so much as we leave you with that question
Yeah.
of what does it mean to profoundly believe essentially a political position, either within a church or within a government, or both. In my case, it's both. And still be leaders for compromise. And I struggle with this. I'm a fighter. I want to fight. And I have to remind myself that there's only one real way to win, and that is for us all to move forward. And if we cannot all move forward, then we have failed. So on that note, thank you very much for joining us on this slightly delayed Sin Boldly. If you have any feedback for the show or want to suggest a topic for us to talk about, if you think we're crazy, if you want to disagree, please sound off at us or to us. Sin Boldly at endfear.org. We have a comments page over on the podcast section of endfear.org. We also have a Facebook page, facebook.com/the Sign Your Name Project. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord and end fear by signing your name. Good night.